For 8 years, the military service framework shaped the daily life of a U.S. Army specialist stationed at Hunter Army Airfield. Official service records confirm that the period included no overseas deployments. Duties were domestic, predictable, and regulated. That chapter concluded in October 2023, when military service ended and civilian life fully resumed. More than 2 years later, on January 4, 2026, a separate and unrelated event unfolded, one with no institutional structure to slow it once it began. The individual charged in the case is Tyler Edward Lynn, who was 30 years old at the time of the incident. According to Savannah police, the confrontation that now defines the case began over a parking space, not a personal history, not a prolonged argument, a disagreement over where a vehicle would be placed. The incident occurred at approximately 4:10 p.m. on a Sunday at a busy shopping center parking lot, a time when families were shopping, children were walking between stores, and traffic moved steadily through the area. The setting was crowded, visible, and familiar in a way that often lowers caution rather than raises it. Shopping center parking lots are designed for efficiency, not conflict resolution. Drivers circle for openings. Pedestrians move unpredictably between cars. Engines idle. Attention is divided. Small frustrations can intensify quickly when space is limited and patience is thin. On this afternoon, that pressure was already present. Savannah police have confirmed that the disagreement over the parking space escalated rapidly. Witnesses described a sudden shift in tone and movement, with little warning and even less time for intervention. The transition from argument to gunfire unfolded in seconds. Parked vehicles narrowed visibility. The density of people reduced safe paths of retreat. Families nearby described confusion as the sound of gunshots cut through the normal noise of a weekend shopping crowd. Parents pulled children close. Shoppers ran or froze behind vehicles. What had been an ordinary Sunday afternoon became chaotic without warning. The victim was identified as Matthew Trawick, 33 years old. Trawick was a father of 3 and an employee at Vaden Automotive. Emergency responders arrived quickly and transported him to Memorial Health University Medical Center. Despite medical efforts, Trawick succumbed to multiple gunshot wounds. His death turned a brief dispute over a parking space into a permanent loss for his family and a defining trauma for those who witnessed the scene. Prosecutors allege that Lynn's actions during the confrontation caused Trawick's death and created danger within a crowded public space. Based on those allegations, he was charged with murder. He was also charged with aggravated assault. While some primary police reporting focuses heavily on the fatal shooting itself, the aggravated assault charge reflects a standard legal response when gunfire endangers others nearby, even if no additional victims are ultimately killed. In a densely populated parking lot, the presence of multiple bystanders factors directly into how charges are structured. The public nature of the setting remains central to how the case is understood. This was not a secluded area. It was daylight in front of families, shoppers, and workers. Visibility did not prevent the escalation. It widened the impact. Dozens of people were exposed to lethal violence in a place they associated with routine errands and safety through familiarity. After the shooting, the shopping center parking lot changed instantly. Sirens replaced music from nearby stores. Police secured the area. Investigators marked evidence and collected statements. Within hours, the physical location began returning to its commercial purpose. Stores reopened, vehicles parked again. The space itself moved on, even as the consequences remained fixed elsewhere. Lynn was taken into custody and transported to the Chatham County Detention Center. Court records confirm that he has been held without bond since his arrest. The no-bond status reflects judicial assessments tied to the severity of the charges and the circumstances of the incident. As of mid-January 2026, the case remains pending. No plea has been entered and no verdict has been reached. Lynn is scheduled for a Superior Court appearance on January 29, 2026, marking the next procedural stage in the case. The impact of the January 4, 2026 shooting extended well beyond the parking lot itself. Trawick's death resonated across the Savannah community. On January 15, 2026, a community trivia fundraiser was held to support his family. A GoFundMe campaign established for his wife and children has raised more than $136,000, reflecting both the financial strain created by his death and the scale of public support. These efforts cannot change the outcome, but they show how one moment of violence reshapes many lives. If you believe these stories should not remain untold, please support my channel by smashing the like button and subscribing. I'd really appreciate the support. Thank you very much. The parking lot disputes escalate as we move to Case 2. On January 11, 2026, the immediate spark appeared simple: a workplace dispute between employees at the SAT2 Amazon Fulfillment Center on the far west side of Bexar County, Texas. Inside large facilities, disagreements are routine. Long hours, pressure, and personality clashes often create tension that fades by the end of a shift. On that night, however, the disagreement did not end when the work stopped. The trigger was a decision made before employees clocked out. The conflict would continue outside, in the parking lot. The deeper cause was already forming well before anyone stepped into the open air. Investigators later confirmed that the confrontation was planned. Messages were exchanged. The parking lot was selected deliberately. Most importantly, additional backup was summoned. This was no longer about resolving an argument. It had become about pride, loyalty, and refusing to back down. Once others were invited into the conflict, the situation shifted from personal disagreement to collective escalation, where retreat felt unacceptable. Shortly after 10 p.m., employees exited the SAT2 facility near U.S. Highway 90 and Loop 1604. The parking lot filled with cars, headlights cutting through the darkness in familiar patterns. Within that ordinary scene, the planned meeting unfolded. Individuals involved in the dispute gathered near parked vehicles. Voices rose, postures stiffened. This face-to-face encounter was the trigger moment. At that point, nothing irreversible had happened. The confrontation still had space to dissolve. That space disappeared because escalation had already occurred away from the scene. Legal records established that at least one individual arrived armed with a firearm. The weapon was not produced suddenly in panic. Its presence reflected earlier decisions to prepare for violence. Calling for armed backup fundamentally changed the encounter. The deeper cause was no longer the original workplace disagreement, but the belief that force might be required to settle it. Once weapons were introduced, the likelihood of a deadly outcome increased dramatically. Gunfire erupted in the parking lot. The sound shattered the routine calm of the shift change. Employees nearby ran or froze, unsure where safety lay. 2 men were struck by bullets. The trigger event itself lasted only seconds, but it permanently altered lives. A space designed for arrival and departure became a scene of chaos and fear. The consequences unfolded quickly. One victim, Catriel Marc-Anthony Delosier, 26, was transported to a hospital where he later died from his injuries. The second victim, Johnny Bermea III, was also shot and survived. Both men were caught in the same planned confrontation. The difference between survival and death came down to circumstance, not intent. The cause, escalation fueled by group reinforcement and access to firearms, placed both lives in danger. Deputies from the Bexar County Sheriff's Office secured the SAT2 parking lot and began an intensive investigation focused on the shooting itself. Crime scene tape stretched across rows of employee vehicles. Witnesses were separated and interviewed. Ambulances departed. The visible trigger, the gunfire, became the focal point of public attention. To understand why the shooting happened, investigators traced events backward. Surveillance footage from the facility and surrounding areas was reviewed. Witness statements were collected. Cell phone data helped establish who was present and how they arrived. These sources confirmed that the shooting occurred during a planned fight in which additional backup had been summoned, and firearms were present. This distinction was critical. Because the fatal shooting occurred during a coordinated confrontation, prosecutors charged Jamari McKillian, 21, and David Perez Morales Jr., 20, with murder under Texas law. Arrests followed in the days after the shooting. McKillian was taken into custody at SAT-4, a different Amazon fulfillment center on the east side of San Antonio, where he was employed. Morales was arrested separately at a relative's home. A vehicle connected to the incident was seized as evidence. These actions marked the system's response to the trigger event that unfolded at SAT-2. Beyond the arrests, the deeper impact settled in quieter ways. Employees returned to the SAT-2 facility under increased security. For many, the parking lot no longer felt like a neutral space. The family of Catriel Marcanthony Delosier faced a loss that could not be undone. Johnny Bermia III faced recovery from a gunshot wound and the psychological weight of surviving a confrontation that ended another life. None of these outcomes were caused by the original argument alone. What happened at SAT-2 does not stand alone. It ends one story, but it also opens the door to the next. Because this case shows how fast a shared space can shift from routine to loss, the pattern continues beyond this parking lot, into other places where conflict followed people outside and the outcome could not be taken back. Now, driving into Case 3, where the escalation did not begin with violence. It began with a parked car. On June 11, 2023, in an Annapolis, Maryland neighborhood, a vehicle was parked directly in front of a home belonging to Charles Robert Smith. That single placement became the first rung on the escalation ladder. According to charging documents and court filings, Smith's mother contacted authorities to make a parking complaint about the vehicle outside their residence. At that moment, the conflict was still procedural. No shouting, no physical contact. Just a call meant to resolve a space issue through official channels. The next rung came when the situation did not end with the call. The presence of the car remained. Frustration did not drain away. It stayed in place. Words were exchanged between people connected to the gathering and the residents of the home. Witness statements later described a tense interaction, but still one rooted in ordinary disagreement. No one had been hurt. No weapon had been introduced. The dispute was active, unresolved, and visible. This was the stage where the conflict could still have ended if distance had been created. It was not. The third rung involved persistence. The disagreement did not fade with time. Instead, it hardened. What began as a complaint about a parked car became personal. The issue was no longer just about access or space, but about authority and refusal to yield. Investigators later emphasized that the confrontation unfolded openly, not suddenly, and not in secret. Each minute the dispute stayed alive, added pressure. Nothing snapped. Everything accumulated. The fourth rung was the introduction of a weapon. According to prosecutors, Smith produced a handgun during the confrontation and fired at close range. Mario Antonio Morelos Ruiz, age 27, and Christian Marlon Segovia, age 24, were shot first. This was the moment when the latter crossed from confrontation into irreversible harm. The dispute was no longer verbal. It was no longer recoverable. People nearby ran. Others moved toward the wounded to help. The environment shifted instantly from argument to emergency. The fifth rung followed immediately and deepened the damage. After the initial shots, Smith went inside his home. He did not leave the situation. He escalated it. Prosecutors allege that he retrieved a rifle, returned to an upper window, and fired additional rounds toward people who were attempting to assist the victims. This second phase of gunfire expanded the harm outward. Nicholas Morales, age 55, was killed. 3 additional people were wounded. What began with a single parked car had now produced 6 shooting victims across multiple moments of action. Emergency responders arrived to a scene defined by chaos and fear. The neighborhood was secured. Victims were transported to hospitals. 3 lives were already lost. The 6th rung of the ladder came when law enforcement moved from response to accountability. Smith was taken into custody and later charged with multiple counts, including 3 counts of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and related offenses. Prosecutors also pursued hate crime enhancements based on evidence gathered during the investigation. The 7th rung shifted the escalation from the street to the courtroom. An indictment was returned in July 2023. The case moved through pretrial motions and into a full jury trial in early February 2025. Families attended, evidence was presented, witnesses testified. The legal process appeared to be moving toward a conclusion. Instead, the progression halted. On February 26, 2025, the judge declared a mistrial after determining that certain evidence had been improperly introduced to the jury. The latter did not descend, it stopped mid-climb. The 8th rung added uncertainty rather than resolution. After the mistrial, prosecutors prepared for a retrial. Initial reporting suggested a new trial date later in 2025. That date did not hold. As motions were filed and arguments expanded, the timeline stretched further. By late 2025, reporting confirmed that the next trial date had been pushed into 2026, leaving the case unresolved years after the shooting itself. The 9th and current rung involves a legal question that may determine whether the latter can continue at all. As of the most recent updates leading into 2026, the case is paused due to an interlocutory appeal filed by the defense. The appeal asks higher courts to decide whether a retrial is legally permitted under double jeopardy protections following the mistrial. Until that question is answered, no new trial can proceed. The legal process is suspended, not concluded. What happened here was not unique. It followed a familiar path where small disputes are left to build into something more devastating. The next case begins in a different place, with different people, but filled with more danger. I'd really appreciate it if you take a moment to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for your support. In the 4th case, Kentravian Jajuan Evans, age 18 at the time, was identified by police as the suspect in a fatal shooting that occurred outside a Whataburger on South Jefferson Avenue in Mount Pleasant during the early morning hours of February 25, 2023. The shooting followed an altercation that began inside the restaurant and continued into the parking lot, resulting in the death of a 30-year-old man. The account of this case is based strictly on police statements, contemporaneous news reporting, and publicly available court information, without speculation about motive or psychological intent. According to the Mount Pleasant Police Department, officers were dispatched at approximately 2:18 a.m. on February 25, 2023, after receiving a 911 call reporting a shooting in the parking lot of the Whataburger located on South Jefferson Avenue. When officers arrived, they found a man lying in the parking lot with multiple gunshot wounds. Emergency medical personnel were immediately requested to the scene. The victim was identified as Damian O'Neill Jackson, age 30. Emergency responders provided medical assistance before transporting Jackson to Titus Regional Medical Center. Despite treatment efforts, Jackson later died from his injuries. Police confirmed his death later that morning. Investigators determined that the shooting did not occur randomly. Police stated that the incident stemmed from an altercation that began inside the restaurant shortly before the shooting. Multiple individuals were involved in the disturbance. As the situation escalated, restaurant employees intervened and instructed those involved to leave the building. This directive ended the disturbance inside the restaurant, but did not end the conflict itself. Once outside, the argument continued in the parking lot. Police have not publicly released detailed descriptions of the verbal exchange or physical movements between individuals, but they confirmed that the confrontation moved directly from the interior of the restaurant to the exterior parking area. Within a short period of time, gunfire occurred. After securing the scene, officers closed off sections of the parking lot and began collecting evidence. Investigators interviewed witnesses who had been present inside the restaurant and outside in the parking lot at the time of the shooting. Police also reviewed available surveillance footage from the restaurant and surrounding area as part of the investigation. Later that same morning, at approximately 9:20 a.m., Mount Pleasant police arrested Kentravian Jahwan Evans in connection with the shooting. He was taken into custody without reported incident and formally charged with murder. Authorities stated at the time of the arrest that no additional suspects were being sought and that the investigation was focused solely on Evans's actions during the confrontation. Following his arrest, Evans was booked into custody as the case moved into the Texas criminal court system. Prosecutors prepared formal charges based on witness statements, physical evidence, and investigative findings. Court filings confirm that Evans was charged with murder under Texas law. Beyond the initial charge, officials did not release detailed statements regarding plea negotiations, trial scheduling, or anticipated timelines. It is important to note that no widely published or independently verified public records confirm a final disposition of this case. While Evans was charged in 2023 and the case progressed through pretrial stages, there is no confirmed public documentation establishing that the case concluded with a guilty plea, jury verdict, or sentencing as of January 2026. Any claims regarding specific sentence lengths or plea dates are not supported by broadly accessible court records or mainstream news reporting. Because of this, the confirmed legal status that can be accurately stated is limited to the following. Evans was charged with murder, arrested on the same day as the shooting, and remained subject to the Texas judicial process. For the most current and authoritative information regarding case disposition, sentencing, or plea outcomes, official records from the Titus County District Clerk would be required. This case concludes with a confirmed timeline and a final legal outcome, but it does not stand alone. Similar disputes have unfolded in other ordinary places, following the same rapid progression from argument to irreversible loss. The next case is even more devastating. Let's get into Case 5. The parking lot of the Hamlet Shopping Center was active just after midnight on December 21, 2025. Cars moved through narrow lanes. Headlights swept across the pavement. Voices and music carried from inside the complex, where a birthday party was underway at the Dreams Entertainment Center. People gathered near vehicles, watching arrivals and departures. Nothing about the scene suggested it was moments away from becoming a homicide investigation. Outside the venue stood Ramon Armendariz Jr., 16 years old. Police later confirmed that Armendariz was acting as security for the private party inside Dreams Entertainment Center. His role placed him outside the event, near the parking lot where guests entered and exited. What follows in this script includes narrative interpretation used to explain how disputes in shared spaces often escalate. These interpretations are not presented by police as official conclusions, but as context for understanding the sequence of events. Earlier in the evening, surveillance footage captured Armendariz interacting with another teen who was also helping with security. During what investigators described as horseplay, video shows Armendariz pulling a handgun from his waistband. The weapon was not fired at that time, and the interaction did not escalate further. Police later noted this detail to establish that Armendariz was armed earlier in the night. There is no indication in court records that the handgun was drawn during the later confrontation with the vehicle. As the night progressed, attention shifted toward the parking lot. Surveillance footage reviewed by investigators shows Armendariz approaching a Ford Fusion parked near the venue. Witness statements indicate that the interaction began verbally. Some witnesses reported that Armendariz and a passenger inside the vehicle were engaged in a verbal argument before any physical contact occurred. Words were exchanged. Voices rose. In public spaces like parking lots, verbal disputes often become tests of resolve, where neither side wants to appear to back down in front of others. The confrontation escalated. According to court documents, Armendariz punched a passenger seated in the back seat of the Ford Fusion. That action marked a turning point. Physical contact ended any remaining distance between the individuals involved. Moments later, the situation moved beyond recovery. Legal documents specify the shooter's movements in detail. Tracy Deshawn Talley, 22, who had been seated in the front passenger seat of the Ford Fusion, exited the vehicle and leaned across the roof. From that position, Talley fired 2 shots. Both rounds struck Armendariz in the right collarbone area. The vehicle then began to flee the parking lot. Officers in the area heard the gunfire almost immediately. Police later confirmed that officers were already nearby, assisting with an unrelated chase when the shots were fired. Their proximity allowed for a rapid response. Officers moved toward the sound of gunfire and attempted life-saving measures. Despite those efforts, Ramon Armendariz Jr. was pronounced dead at 12:15 a.m. at the scene. The exchange did not end with the initial gunfire. Court records confirm that Damon Blair, 19, who was attending the party, fired 5 shots toward the fleeing Ford Fusion after Armendariz was shot. Police reports state that no injuries were reported as a result of this secondary gunfire. Investigators documented the shots as part of the sequence, but did not report any additional victims. The Ford Fusion fled the shopping center immediately after the shooting. Later that same day, police tracked the vehicle to a residence on Hancock Street in Amarillo. According to legal documents, officers located Talley hiding inside a garage at the property. During the search, investigators recovered a semi-automatic handgun believed to be connected to the shooting, along with clothing matching what Talley was seen wearing in surveillance footage from the parking lot. On the evening of December 21, 2025, Talley was arrested and charged with murder. The charge followed the review of surveillance video, witness statements, and physical evidence. The arrest addressed criminal responsibility, while investigators continued to document the precise timeline and actions leading up to the shooting. The next case unfolds under intense pressures, where distance disappears and control collapses just as quickly. Moving to the 6th case, the legal outcome settled the question of responsibility before the story ever returned to the parking lot. In May 2023, a Multnomah County jury convicted private security guard Logan Conrad Gimbel of second-degree murder for the 2021 killing of Freddie Nelson Jr. The verdict rejected self-defense and established that deadly force was not justified. Gimbel was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. 1 year later, in September 2024, a civil jury widened that judgment. Nelson's family was awarded $21.25 million in a wrongful death lawsuit, with jurors finding the property manager and security company largely responsible for encouraging a culture where force replaced restraint. Those outcomes pointed back to a single narrowing instant in May 2021, when choice collapsed and retreat disappeared. The location was the Delta Park shopping area in North Portland near a Lowe's store. It was a public parking lot built for short stops and constant turnover. Cars came and went. People crossed between vehicles and storefronts. Freddie Nelson Jr., 49 years old, sat inside his truck. He had been involved in an ongoing dispute with the property management company over collecting discarded wooden pallets from the lot. The disagreement was known and recurring, not new or sudden. Logan Conrad Gimbel approached Nelson while working as a private security guard assigned to the property. A critical fact later established in court shaped how the encounter was judged. Gimbel was not licensed to carry a firearm as a security guard at the time of the shooting. The authority he presented did not match the legal permissions he actually held. That gap mattered because it framed the moment not as a necessary enforcement action, but as an escalation without proper safeguards. The interaction tightened quickly. It did not stretch across the lot or involve a prolonged argument. Words were exchanged at close range. The truck remained where it was. Nelson stayed seated inside the vehicle. Surveillance footage reviewed by investigators later showed no clear movement that placed the guard in immediate danger. This detail became central because the defense would later argue that Nelson lurched his truck toward Gimbel, causing fear for his life. That claim did not hold up under scrutiny. Eyewitnesses at the scene and video evidence contradicted the idea that the truck posed an imminent threat. Investigators focused on the exact geometry of the moment: the distance, the angles, the timing. The evidence showed Nelson inside his vehicle, unarmed, with alternatives still available to both men. The parking lot itself offered space to step away, pause, or call for assistance. This was the point of no return, as the courts later defined it. Retreat had not vanished because of physical limitation. It vanished because it was rejected. Options still existed. De-escalation was still possible. The situation had not reached a threshold where lethal force was required. When the firearm was raised, the narrowing completed. The gunshot erased every remaining alternative in an instant. Nelson was struck while seated in his truck and collapsed in the parking lot. A place designed for brief encounters became the site of a permanent loss. Shoppers nearby were left frozen by how fast the moment closed. Police arrived to a scene that looked ordinary except for the body on the concrete and the sudden stillness that followed. Parked cars remained. Storefronts stayed lit. The contrast between the setting and the outcome became impossible to ignore. The criminal investigation centered on necessity. Self-defense under the law requires more than fear. It requires an immediate threat and no reasonable alternative. Prosecutors presented video footage frame by frame. Witnesses described what they saw. The state emphasized that Nelson was inside his vehicle and that the claim of a lurch forward did not align with the evidence. The argument was not about whether the encounter felt tense. It was about whether lethal force was required. In May 2023, the jury answered that question. By convicting Gimbel of second-degree murder, jurors stated that the line had been crossed when other paths still existed. The verdict made clear that wearing a uniform does not remove the duty to withdraw, slow down, or call for help. The sentence that followed reflected the weight of a decision made in seconds. The Case 7 unfolded in one section of the Finley Forest condominiums. A parking lot sat under routine strain, limited spaces, familiar cars, and the ordinary friction of shared living. In another apartment, 3 students sat together, focused on school, service, and plans that stretched far beyond the complex. These scenes unfolded at the same time, side by side, unaware that they were moving toward the same night. Across the property, frustration had been repeating itself for months. Parking complaints resurfaced again and again. According to court testimony, confrontations followed a pattern: irritation that did not dissipate, arguments that did not reset. For Craig Stephen Hicks, parking had become a stand-in for control. Witnesses later testified that while he was confrontational with many neighbors, his aggression escalated most sharply toward neighbors of color or those who were visibly religious. In those encounters, prosecutors said, he was more likely to brandish weapons. The behavior was not isolated. It accumulated. At the same time, life inside the apartment moved forward without tension. Dia Shadi Barakat, a dental student at the University of North Carolina, organized his days around exams, volunteering, and fundraising. He and his wife were actively planning a humanitarian trip to Turkey to provide free dental care to Syrian refugees. The details mattered: supplies, travel, timelines. His focus was outward, toward service. Nearby, Yusor Mohammed Abu Salha was preparing to begin dental school after already receiving her acceptance. Friends described her as disciplined and hopeful, someone who treated planning as a way to help others more effectively. The upcoming humanitarian mission was not symbolic. It was scheduled. It was practical. It was close. And present with them was Razan Mohammed Abu Salha, Yusor's younger sister. At 19, she was studying architecture at North Carolina State University. She was visiting family, splitting her time between coursework and connection. Her life was still expanding, shaped by learning and creativity. She had no role in any dispute. She was there because her family was there. These parallel paths drew closer on February 10, 2015. Inside the apartment, the evening unfolded like many others. Conversation, planning, routine comfort. Outside, the familiar grievance returned. What made this encounter different, according to evidence presented in court, was that it was recorded. As Hicks approached, Dia Barakat activated his cell phone camera. The video captured the immediate pretext for the confrontation. Hicks can be heard telling Dia, "You've got 3 cars in the lot, and I don't have a parking spot." Investigators later confirmed that none of the students' vehicles were parked in Hicks's assigned space. The complaint was voiced anyway. There was no extended exchange, no pause long enough to change course. The recording confirmed that the parking dispute was the stated reason at the door. What followed ended 3 lives inside the apartment. The space that had held plans for school and humanitarian work became a crime scene. The shift was sudden and final. As police secured the scene at Finley Forest condominiums, understanding lagged behind events. Early statements emphasized the parking dispute. As testimony emerged, a deeper pattern came into focus: repeated hostility, targeted intimidation, and escalation over time. Families and supporters questioned whether parking alone could explain what had happened. Federal authorities reviewed the case for potential hate crime charges, but later stated they could not meet the legal standard required under federal law. The state prosecution focused on what could be proven beyond doubt. Prosecutors presented the pattern of behavior, the recorded confrontation, and the absence of any legitimate parking violation. The case was not framed as a sudden misunderstanding between strangers. It was framed as escalation anger rehearsed over time and unleashed without restraint. Years later, in June 2019, the legal process reached its conclusion. Hicks pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence closed the case in court, but it did not close the impact. The victims were remembered for how they lived, for service, for education, for plans to help others far beyond Chapel Hill. Scholarships and foundations carried their names forward. At the same time, the case became a reference point in discussions about how recurring, low-level conflicts can harden into something lethal when patterns of hostility are ignored. What happened at Finley Forest did not begin or end there. It shows how ordinary conflicts can quietly repeat until control replaces restraint. As we move to Case 8, the tension gets more intense. October 7th, 2025, was the day a routine shopping trip in Dallas turned into a fatal parking lot shooting outside PetSmart. The encounter involved 2 strangers with no prior relationship and no history of conflict. What unfolded was not a planned act of violence, but a rapid escalation shaped by proximity, persistence, physical confrontation, and ultimately the introduction of a firearm. Earlier that day, Cecilia Simpson, 41, was shopping with her 20-year-old daughter, who would later be identified as the primary witness. Inside a nearby store within the same shopping plaza, Simpson held a door open for Kiona Zakua Hampton, 22. Hampton did not acknowledge the gesture, and words were exchanged. At that moment, the interaction was verbal and brief. There were no threats, and no physical contact occurred. The situation could have ended at the doorway, but irritation carried the encounter forward. After leaving the store, Simpson and her daughter returned to their vehicle and drove a short distance to the PetSmart located in the same plaza. According to statements later referenced by investigators, they believed Hampton followed them. This belief marked a shift in the interaction. What had started as a chance encounter now felt intentional to those being followed. Inside the PetSmart, the argument resumed. This time, Simpson's daughter became directly involved. Raised voices and continued confrontation drew attention from others in the store. The space was still public, but the tone had changed from momentary frustration to sustained conflict. At this stage, the imbalance was not physical. It was directional. Hampton continued to engage and press the interaction forward. Simpson and her daughter appeared focused on completing their errand and leaving. That difference mattered. One side persisted, the other reacted. When all parties exited the store, the environment changed again. The confrontation moved into the parking lot, a space with proximity, vehicles limiting movement, and no built-in structure for resolving disputes. According to the Dallas County arrest warrant affidavit, Hampton escalated the situation physically by throwing a bottle at Simpson's vehicle. This act represented a clear transition from verbal disagreement to physical provocation. Once objects are thrown, the margin for calm resolution narrows significantly. Distance closes, emotions rise. The encounter near the vehicles became volatile within seconds. For accuracy, it is essential to describe what happened next without omission. Police affidavits state that Simpson physically engaged Hampton, striking her several times immediately before the shots were fired. This clarification matters because it shows that the final moments involved direct physical confrontation between both parties. The encounter was no longer defined by words or pursuit alone. It had become a physical struggle in close quarters, where reactions were fast and reassessment was unlikely. The decisive shift occurred when Hampton produced a handgun. At that moment, the balance changed completely. Physical engagement no longer mattered. One person now had access to lethal force. Multiple shots were fired in the parking lot. Simpson was struck and fell. Emergency responders were called, and she was transported to a hospital, where she later died from her injuries. The transition from argument to gunfire happened rapidly, leaving no opportunity for retreat or intervention. After the shooting, Hampton fled the scene. Dallas police responded quickly, secured the area, and interviewed witnesses, including Simpson's daughter, who had been present from the initial store interaction through the final moments in the parking lot. Later that day, Hampton was located, arrested, and booked into the Dallas County Jail, where she was charged with murder. The arrest warrant affidavit outlined the progression of events, including the bottle being thrown, the physical confrontation, and the use of the firearm. As of mid-January 2026, Hampton remains in custody at the Dallas County Jail. Court records show a bond of $100,000 was set following her October 2025 arrest. Prosecutors continue preparing the case for trial. The Dallas Police Department and the Dallas County District Attorney's Office are still processing evidence, including surveillance footage and cell phone video recorded by witnesses. While the initial affidavit provides a clear sequence of events, additional evidence is being reviewed as part of the ongoing legal process. The age difference between the two women was noted in reporting, but age alone does not explain the outcome, nor does location or time of day. What mattered was escalation and access. The facts supported by police records show a steady tightening of the situation, with each stage reducing the ability to disengage safely. Once physical contact occurred, reactions intensified. Once the firearm appeared, the imbalance became final. The presence of Simpson's 20-year-old daughter adds important context. She was not a distant observer arriving after the fact. She was present throughout the encounter, witnessing each stage as it unfolded. Her proximity shows how quickly ordinary public interactions can place family members into life-altering situations without warning. The impact of the event extended beyond the immediate loss of life to those who witnessed it firsthand. What happened outside the Dallas PetSmart began as a brief interaction and ended through escalation rather than intent. The setting, the decisions made, and the loss of distance shaped the outcome. This case is one of many where ordinary spaces become pressure points, showing how quickly everyday disputes can move beyond control. On to the ninth case, Michael Draka entered the Circle A food store parking lot in Clearwater, Florida, on July 19, 2018, carrying a mindset shaped by pressure that had built long before that afternoon. Investigators later confirmed that Draka had a pattern of involving himself in parking disputes at the same location and had previously contacted law enforcement about similar issues. This was not a spontaneous moment of concern. It was the continuation of a fixation that had already reduced his emotional tolerance. The setting was ordinary, but demanding. It was midday. The heat was heavy. Cars moved in tight spaces. Public parking lots offer little privacy and even less patience. That environment compressed emotion before the confrontation even began. Draka noticed a car parked in a disabled space without a visible placard and approached the driver, who was later identified as the girlfriend of Marquise McLaughlin, 28. Witnesses said Draka spoke firmly and remained close as he addressed her. The exchange was brief but tense. There was no cooling off period, no moment where either person stepped away. Stress shortened the interaction. Emotional compression narrowed the range of responses available, pushing the situation forward without room for restraint. McLaughlin exited the store and immediately saw the confrontation. He had no prior interaction with Draka and no awareness of Draka's history of parking complaints. What he saw was simple and direct: a man confronting his girlfriend. His response came quickly. McLaughlin moved toward Draka and shoved him to the ground. The shove was forceful but brief. Surveillance footage later showed that once Draka fell, McLaughlin stepped back. The physical contact stopped. Distance returned to the space between them. What did not return was emotional balance. As Draka stood up, the window for restraint had already closed. He drew a handgun and fired one shot into McLaughlin's chest. From the shove to the gunshot, only seconds passed. There was no ongoing struggle. There was no renewed attack. McLaughlin was unarmed. He collapsed in the parking lot and later died at the hospital. The environment resumed movement almost immediately, but the decision made under compressed emotion could not be undone. The shooting quickly became a national focal point, not only because of the death, but because of how authorities initially responded. Pinellas County Sheriff Bob Gualtieri announced shortly after the incident that Draka would not be arrested at that time, citing Florida's Stand Your Ground law. That decision sparked widespread debate. Critics focused on the visible pause between the shove and the gunshot. Supporters emphasized Draka's claim of fear. The surveillance video circulated widely, placing the timeline under intense public scrutiny. The case was later transferred to the state attorney's office for Florida's 6th Judicial Circuit. After reviewing the footage and witness statements, prosecutors reached a different conclusion. On August 13, 2018, Draka was charged with manslaughter. The charge rested on timing and separation. Prosecutors argued that the threat had ended when McLaughlin stepped back and that emotional response, even under stress or fear, did not justify lethal force once the immediate danger had passed. During the 2019 trial, the concept of emotional compression was examined through evidence rather than language. Jurors watched the surveillance footage repeatedly. They measured seconds. They examined distance. The defense emphasized Draka's perception of danger and presented expert testimony about his mental state. The prosecution focused on the objective sequence: confrontation, shove, separation, pause, shot. The jury was asked to decide whether deadly force was legally justified at that exact moment, not whether fear existed in general. The verdict was guilty. In October 2019, Draka was sentenced to 20 years in prison. During sentencing, the judge rejected the self-defense framing and made a pointed observation, describing Draka as a wannabe law enforcement officer. The comment reflected the court's view that Draka had inserted himself into a situation he did not need to control and escalated it beyond necessity. The court emphasized that Draka initiated the confrontation and that the fatal decision came after the physical threat had ended. The legal process continued after sentencing. In 2021, Draka appealed his conviction, arguing that errors had occurred during trial. The appeal was rejected, and the conviction and sentence were upheld. While incarcerated, Draka was reportedly attacked by another inmate in 2020. The incident briefly returned attention to his case, but did not change his legal standing. As of when this video was uploaded, Draka remains in Florida State Prison. Official Department of Corrections records list his projected release date as October 2036. Under Florida law, inmates must serve at least 85% of their sentence. While gain time for good behavior may adjust the date earlier, the October 2036 projection remains the formal reference point used by corrections authorities. In the next story, which is the case 10, compressed moments led to an irreversible outcome. Police responded in October 2022 to what was first described as a parking-related disturbance. By the time officers arrived, the confrontation had already moved beyond the open space where it began. 33-year-old Christopher Allen, known as Dice, had been shot. The situation was no longer unfolding in a parking lot. According to prosecutors, Allen had retreated into his home and called emergency services, believing the conflict had ended. It had not. The violence followed him inside. From the earliest stages of the investigation, police established that the dispute did not originate from a prior relationship or long-standing grievance. It began with parking, how vehicles were positioned, how space was shared, how behavior was interpreted. No evidence presented in court showed premeditation or planning. Instead, the case centered on perception and reaction. Ordinary actions were assigned, meaning they did not need to carry. Witness statements and investigative findings showed that multiple people were present during the initial confrontation. At sentencing, the defense emphasized this point, arguing that Robert Salone felt surrounded and outnumbered. Defense attorneys also stated that Allen was holding a tire iron during the exchange outside, framing the situation as more threatening than the prosecution suggested. These claims were raised to explain Salone's state of mind, not to dispute that the fatal shots were fired after Allen had disengaged. What prosecutors focused on was timing. Even accepting that the situation felt chaotic in the parking area, the threat had ended when Allen retreated. Evidence showed that Allen went inside his residence and called for help. At that point, the confrontation no longer involved a crowd, raised voices, or physical positioning. It involved a person attempting to disengage. Prosecutors argued that this moment marked a clear boundary, one that was crossed when Salone followed Allen inside and fired the fatal shots. Investigators reconstructed the sequence carefully. Surveillance footage, witness testimony, and physical evidence showed how quickly the encounter escalated. There was no long negotiation and no pause that reset the situation. Instead, each action was interpreted as confirmation of hostility. A refusal to yield space became defiance. Movement toward a residence was not read as retreat, but as continuation. In this pattern, neutral behavior lost its original meaning. As the case developed, detectives uncovered evidence that expanded the scope of the investigation beyond the 2022 killing. Ballistics analysis linked Salone to an earlier shooting from August 2021. That incident occurred at an apartment complex on Whitney Ranch Drive in Henderson. According to police reports, Salone fired at a driver who had double parked. No one was killed in that incident, but prosecutors highlighted the similarity. Another parking dispute, another perceived provocation, another firearm introduced into an everyday conflict. This earlier shooting became central to understanding the 2022 case. Prosecutors argued that the Allen killing was not an isolated lapse, but part of a repeated response to perceived disrespect. Minor frustrations were interpreted as challenges. Challenges were met with force. The defense acknowledged the 2021 incident, but argued that Salone felt threatened in both situations. The court ultimately weighed these arguments against the full body of evidence. The legal resolution reflected that balance. The case did not end with a jury verdict. In April 2025, Salone entered an Alford plea, acknowledging that prosecutors had sufficient evidence to convict him at trial without formally admitting guilt. The plea covered both the murder of Christopher Allen and the attempted murder tied to the 2021 Whitney Ranch Drive shooting. At sentencing in July 2025, the court addressed the pattern as a whole. Salone was sentenced to 21 years to life in prison. Prosecutors emphasized that the sentence accounted for repetition, escalation, and the fact that Allen had attempted to disengage and seek help. The defense reiterated its position that Salone perceived himself as threatened, citing the presence of multiple people and the tire iron. The court concluded that, regardless of perception, the use of lethal force after retreat could not be justified. On to Case 11. North Spring Street in East Baltimore is a one-way residential corridor where parking is notoriously difficult. Cars line both sides, leaving little room to move, even on calm days. Long before August 18, 2024, neighbors had described the block as tense whenever members of a local motorcycle club gathered there. Residents later told reporters they had complained to the city about noise, congestion, and repeated parking conflicts. That unresolved history mattered because when violence erupted, it did not appear suddenly. It unfolded in a place where frustration had been allowed to sit without intervention. On the evening of August 18th, motorcycles and cars again crowded the one-way street. Parking became scarce almost immediately. Arguments formed over where vehicles could fit. What was missing was oversight. Despite earlier complaints, no authority was present to manage parking or de-escalate tensions. The absence of early control allowed familiar pressure points to surface again, only this time with far more dangerous results. There was no silence to slow the moment. Witnesses later said voices rose quickly and stayed loud. People stood close because the street's layout forced them to. The narrow, one-way design meant there was little room to step back or disengage. Without physical distance, emotion stayed locked in place, feeding the argument rather than easing it. Mediation was also absent. No neutral party stepped in early enough to separate those involved or redirect the situation. According to police accounts and charging documents, the disagreement centered on a residential parking spot, but neighbors emphasized that it reflected longer-standing tension tied to repeated gatherings and the feeling that earlier complaints had not led to meaningful action. The argument carried weight because it was not isolated. When gunfire began, the absence of structure became deadly. Surveillance footage and police reports later indicated that multiple shooters were involved. Shots came from more than one direction, adding confusion to an already crowded scene. Parked cars blocked sightlines. People could not easily tell where danger was coming from. Panic spread through a space that offered no clear escape. 8 people were struck by gunfire. Anthony Martin, 36, suffered fatal injuries. 7 others were wounded. Some victims were transported by emergency responders, while others walked into nearby hospitals on their own shortly after the shooting, a detail frequently noted in police reporting after large incidents. The one-way street offered no clear routes out, and its tight layout limited both movement and cover. Witnesses were present in large numbers, but protection was not. Many people saw the argument and the shooting, yet there was no system in place to shield bystanders once the dispute escalated. Residential streets rely on the assumption that conflicts will remain minor. When that assumption fails, there is little to slow the harm. Police arrived after the gunfire, not before. That absence of early authority shaped the outcome. Officers focused on securing the area, locating victims, and preserving evidence. Investigators later relied on surveillance footage, shell casings, and witness statements to reconstruct the event. The response was thorough, but it came only after lives had already been changed. In the weeks that followed, Eric Byron Kibler, 43, was arrested and identified by prosecutors as the lead suspect in Anthony Martin's death. He was charged with first-degree murder and dozens of additional offenses tied to the shooting. Prosecutors presented video evidence showing Kibler firing during the dispute, placing him at the center of the case. However, the legal narrative has remained contested. Kibler's defense has consistently argued that he acted as a peacemaker and fired only in self-defense. According to defense statements, Martin allegedly fired a shot either into the air or toward Kibler first, prompting his response. This claim highlights another absence at the scene: clarity. With multiple armed individuals present and multiple shots fired, the precise second-by-second sequence became difficult to establish beyond dispute. Investigators recovered 52 shell casings from the scene, highlighting the scale and chaos of the gunfire. Surveillance footage confirmed that multiple shooters were present, yet as of January 2026, Kibler remains the only person charged in connection with Martin's death. That distinction has remained central to the case as it moves through the court system. As of January 2026, the primary update in the case involves the ongoing legal proceedings. Kibler faces 47 charges in total. In early 2025, he rejected a plea offer from the state that would have imposed a life sentence with all but 60 years suspended. Following that rejection, the case continued toward trial. He was scheduled for a pre-trial hearing on June 27, 2025, before Judge Copeland and has remained held without bail as proceedings advance. As court proceedings move forward, this case settles into the larger pattern it belongs to. What happened on North Spring Street was not unique to one neighborhood or one dispute. The 12th case unfolds elsewhere, but the same pressures, gaps, and risks travel with it. Money was the first thing exchanged in the parking lot near downtown Houston, and the exact amount was $40. On the night of April 11, 2023, Eric Aguirre and his date each handed over $20 to a man who approached their car and claimed to be in charge of parking. The payment was quick, informal, and meant to solve a simple problem: where to leave the car. $40 total, passed hand to hand, with no receipt and no verification. At that moment, the transaction felt complete. What it actually did was set everything else in motion. According to Houston police, the man who collected the money was 46-year-old Elliot Nix. Investigators later said he was posing as a parking attendant, approaching drivers in the area and asking them to pay to park. Aguirre and his date parked and walked into a nearby restaurant, believing the matter was finished. There was no argument outside, no confrontation, no sign that the exchange would continue. The money was already gone, and the parking lot returned to its usual role as a temporary space people move through without much thought. Inside the restaurant, the meaning of the $40 changed. Aguirre and his date were told by others that the man collecting money outside was not a legitimate parking attendant, and that similar situations had happened before in that area. What had felt like a routine transaction now felt like being taken advantage of. The amount itself did not change. It was still $40, but its meaning shifted. The payment now represented deception, not convenience. That realization did not stay inside the restaurant. Police say Aguirre went back outside. At some point, he returned to his vehicle and retrieved a firearm. Witness statements and investigative reports describe a second encounter between Aguirre and Nix in the parking lot. This time, the interaction was no longer about parking logistics. It was about control, confrontation, and perceived wrongdoing. There was no structure in place to slow things down, no clear authority to intervene. The situation escalated quickly. A single shot was fired. Elliot Nix was struck and collapsed in the parking lot. Emergency responders were called, and Nix was transported to a hospital, where he was pronounced dead. The parking lot became a crime scene, transformed from a place of brief transactions into a location marked by police tape, flashing lights, and unanswered questions. The $40 that started the encounter had already lost all practical meaning. What remained was permanent loss. After the shooting, Aguirre returned to the restaurant. For a short time, it appeared as if the evening might continue, as if the violent moment outside could be separated from what came next. That sense did not last. According to a statement later given by his date, Aguirre began to look uncomfortable soon after returning inside. His behavior changed. The atmosphere shifted. The couple left the restaurant shortly afterward and went to eat at a different location. The attempt to move on did not undo what had already happened. In the days that followed, investigators worked to identify the people involved. Houston police released surveillance images connected to the incident, asking for the public's help. Those images focused attention on the couple seen in the area. Aguirre's date eventually came forward and cooperated with investigators, providing information that helped confirm identities and establish a clearer timeline. Her cooperation moved the case from uncertainty toward formal charges. On April 25, 2023, Eric Aguirre was arrested in Aransas County, Texas. He was extradited to Harris County to face a murder charge related to the shooting. The arrest marked a shift from investigation to prosecution, but it did not bring resolution. It placed the events of April 11th into the criminal justice system, where progress is measured in hearings and filings rather than answers. As legal filings became public, additional details added weight to the aftermath. Court records showed that Aguirre was already on probation at the time of the shooting. He was serving a 10-year probation sentence stemming from a 2017 aggravated assault charge in South Texas. That information reframed the case. The alleged actions on April 11th did not occur in isolation. They intersected with an existing legal obligation, increasing the consequences tied to the shooting. The Harris County legal process moved forward slowly. Aguirre was formally arraigned, and bond was set at $200,000. As of early 2026, the case had continued to move through the court system, with Aguirre held on that bond. Each stage of the process added structure, but not closure. The system focused on evidence, testimony, and legal standards. It did not address why a dispute over $40 escalated beyond restraint. $40 ended one life, but the setting did not make this case unique. Parking lots remain unregulated spaces where brief exchanges can shift without warning. Coming up next is the case 13 with more intense pressure and an irreversible damage. Mr. Justice Garnham spoke slowly as he addressed the courtroom, outlining why the law treated this case as murder and not something lesser. 2 people had been killed in their own home. 2 children had been left without parents. The violence, he said, was deliberate, targeted, and devastating in its impact. The sentence would be life imprisonment. Only after the judge's remarks did the full structure of the case settle into view. The events unfolded in Norton Fitzwarren, a small Somerset village where houses sit close together and parking is often tight. Like many residential streets, disagreements over where cars were left were common. Most ended with frustration or avoidance. One dispute did not. It returned repeatedly, never resolved, becoming part of daily life rather than an isolated argument. Living nearby were Stephen Chappell and Jennifer Chappell, a married couple raising 2 young children. Across the way lived Colin Reeves and his wife. Parking outside the Chappell's home became a recurring source of friction. Words were exchanged more than once. Complaints were made. Nothing dramatic followed any single incident. The issue stayed alive through repetition rather than escalation. What neighbors could not see was how pressure was building behind closed doors. On the evening of 21st November 2021, less than an hour before the killings, Reeves's wife told him she wanted a trial separation. The conversation took place inside their home. It did not involve the Chappells and was not about parking. In court, however, its timing proved critical. Prosecutors argued that this moment acted as an immediate emotional catalyst, colliding with a grievance that had already been allowed to repeat without resolution. After that conversation, Reeves armed himself. He removed a ceremonial dagger from a display frame inside his home. This was not a kitchen knife picked up in the heat of an argument. It was a dagger he had been given when leaving the Royal Engineers, mounted as a keepsake of his military service. The fact that it had to be deliberately taken down mattered. It showed preparation in the minutes before the attack. Reeves did not approach the Chappell's home openly. Evidence showed he climbed a fence separating the properties, then entered through the back door of the house. This detail became important at trial. It demonstrated intent and effort rather than a chance encounter or sudden confrontation. Inside the house, Stephen and Jennifer Chappell were unaware of what was coming. Their 2 young children were asleep upstairs. That detail weighed heavily throughout the proceedings. While the children slept, Reeves attacked the couple with the dagger. The assault lasted around a minute. It was fast, violent, and fatal. Both Stephen and Jennifer Chappell died at the scene. The attack was not discovered by neighbors. It was Reeves himself who alerted the authorities. Minutes after the killings, he called 999. The recording, later played to the jury, captured a clear confession. "I went round with a knife," he said. "I've stabbed both of them." He did not attempt to escape. Police arrived shortly afterward and arrested him. From the outset, there was no dispute about who was responsible. The investigation focused on how and why the killings occurred. Prosecutors traced the long-running parking dispute, showing how the same issue resurfaced repeatedly without resolution. They placed that history alongside the separation conversation, arguing that the combination created a narrow window in which Reeves chose violence. At trial, the defense strategy became a central issue. Reeves did not deny killing Stephen and Jennifer Chappell. Instead, he admitted to manslaughter by diminished responsibility and denied murder. His legal team argued that his mental state at the time reduced his culpability. Forensic psychiatrists gave evidence, and the jury heard detailed assessments of Reeves's mental health. The prosecution challenged that account. They pointed to the deliberate steps taken immediately before the attack: removing the dagger from its display, climbing the fence, entering through the back door, and targeting the victims inside their home. These actions, prosecutors argued, showed control and intent rather than loss of responsibility. After hearing expert psychiatric evidence from both sides, the jury rejected Reeves's defense. They concluded that diminished responsibility did not apply and returned unanimous verdicts of guilty to 2 counts of murder. The verdict reflected the jury's view that Reeves's actions met the legal threshold for murder, despite the mental health evidence presented. Sentencing took place in June 2022. Mr. Justice Garnham imposed a life sentence with a minimum term of 38 years before parole eligibility. He emphasized the brutality of the attack, the use of a weapon brought from Reeves's own home, the deliberate nature of the entry, and the fact that 2 young children were asleep upstairs while their parents were killed below. The judge described that circumstance as one of the most disturbing features of the case. The legal process did not end there. In March 2023, the Court of Appeal reviewed the sentence. Appeal judges ruled that the original minimum term was excessive when Reeves's military service and mental health factors were properly weighed. The minimum term was reduced from 38 years to 35 years. The life sentence itself remained in place. Now to the final case. The confrontation began without warning and without history. In the year 2013, an ordinary visit to an Asda supermarket in Biggleswade, Bedfordshire, placed 2 strangers into a brief interaction that ended with permanent consequences. Alan Watts, aged 65, and Brian Holmes, aged 64, did not know each other and had no prior connection. Both arrived at the store expecting nothing more than a routine errand. What followed unfolded in minutes and was captured in part by CCTV footage later examined in court. The initial exchange began verbally. Witnesses and footage showed Watts shouting a sarcastic remark toward Holmes, saying, "You look like you need a wheelchair." The comment was directed at Holmes because Watts believed incorrectly that Holmes was parking illegally in a disabled bay. That belief was mistaken. Holmes's wife was a legitimate blue badge holder, and the vehicle was entitled to use the space. The misunderstanding escalated into a short argument in the car park. Voices were raised, but there was no prolonged shouting or crowd involvement. The disagreement remained between the 2 men and lasted only moments. The argument turned physical quickly. CCTV evidence and trial testimony established that Watts struck Holmes with 2 punches, described in court as a right-left combination. There were no weapons involved. The blows caused Holmes to lose balance and fall backward. His head struck the hard surface of the car park with force. The injury was immediate and severe. Holmes collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Rather than remaining at the scene or attempting to assist, Watts returned to his vehicle and drove away. This decision, later examined during sentencing, became a significant factor in how the court assessed his conduct. Emergency services were called by others who witnessed Holmes on the ground. Despite medical attention, the head injury proved fatal. Holmes later died as a direct result of blunt force trauma caused by the fall. The physical violence itself was brief, but the consequences were irreversible. The car park, designed for short stops and movement, became the site of a fatal injury in a matter of seconds. The wider context of the loss emerged during the trial. Holmes's family told the court that he had received the all-clear from cancer just days before the incident. After a period of serious illness, he had been told his treatment was successful. That detail was emphasized during sentencing to underline the scale of the loss and the abruptness with which his life ended. A moment of recovery and relief was followed almost immediately by a death that no one had anticipated. Only after the factual sequence was firmly established did expert interpretation enter the discussion. Psychologists who study spontaneous public confrontations explain that car parks are uniquely volatile environments. They combine personal territory, time pressure, and perceived rule-breaking in tight physical spaces. Drivers often interpret actions such as parking position or hesitation as deliberate disrespect, even when no such intent exists. In these environments, individuals are frequently already stressed and less receptive to clarification or correction. Experts note that sarcastic or demeaning remarks can act as immediate accelerants in such encounters. Once dignity feels challenged, emotional responses can bypass reflective thought. In this case, the initial verbal comment framed the interaction as confrontational from the outset. The escalation from words to physical force occurred rapidly, leaving little opportunity for either party to disengage. The legal analysis focused on responsibility rather than motive. Prosecutors did not argue that Watts intended to kill Holmes. Instead, they established that Watts initiated unlawful violence and that this violence directly caused Holmes's death. Under English and Welsh law, intent to kill is not required for a manslaughter conviction when an unlawful act results in fatal injury. The court examined causation, proportionality, and post-incident conduct rather than speculation about mindset. In 2013, Alan Watts was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 5 years in prison. During sentencing, the judge addressed not only the physical act but also Watts's decision to leave the scene. Driving away without offering assistance was described as inhumane and demonstrated a disregard for the consequences of his actions. While the violence was not planned, the court made clear that responsibility does not end when an argument does. If you have watched to this point, it shows you found this video interesting. Please like and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.